There is a castle in Istanbul that tourists walk past every day without realizing what it represents. It is a massive stone building near the financial district with European architecture that looks out of place among the Ottoman mosques and palaces. This building was the headquarters of something that had never existed before in history. It was the office of a foreign corporation that had the legal right to collect taxes from the citizens of a sovereign empire and send that money abroad. For 33 years, this corporation controlled 1/3 of all wealth generated in the Ottoman lands. It decided which roads got built and which schools stayed closed. It had its own army of tax collectors who answered not to the Sultan but to bankers in London and Paris. The Ottomans still had their flag and their Sultan and their capital, but they no longer owned their economy. This is the story of how that happened. This is the story of the first modern debt trap. It is the story of how the most powerful Islamic empire in the world was conquered not by armies but by compound interest. And it is a blueprint that has been used again and again ever since on countries from Argentina to Greece to Egypt. Because the lesson the European bankers learned in Istanbul was simple and brutal. You do not need to invade a country to own it. You just need to own its debt. To understand how the trap was set, you need to see the Ottoman Empire as it was in 1850. On paper, it still looked magnificent. The empire stretched from the gates of Vienna down to the Arabian deserts and across North Africa to Algeria. The Sultan in Istanbul commanded millions of subjects. His ancestors had terrified Christian Europe for 400 years. The very word Ottoman meant power. But the reality behind the palace walls was very different. The economy was dying. While Britain was building steam engines and railways, the Ottomans were still using wooden plows, while France was creating modern banks and stock markets. The Ottoman treasury was still operating like a medieval tax farm where corrupt local officials stole half the revenue before it reached the capital. The problem was not lack of resources. The problem was lack of cash flow. The empire was land rich but money poor. The tax system was so inefficient that the Sultan could not afford to pay his own army on time. Soldiers went months without wages. Governors ruled provinces with no budget. The infrastructure was crumbling. But the worst problem was strategic. To the north, the Russian Empire was expanding aggressively. The Russians wanted warm water ports on the Mediterranean. They wanted control of the straits that connected the Black Sea to the world. Every decade they pushed a little closer to Istanbul. The Sultan knew that one day Russia would invade. And when that day came, he would need a modern army with rifles and cannons and warships to defend the empire. But modern weapons cost money, lots of money, money the Sultan did not have. For centuries, Islamic law had forbidden the charging of interest on loans. This made borrowing from European banks culturally unacceptable. Ottoman sultans had always found other ways to raise cash. They debased the currency. They confiscated the estates of dead officials. They squeezed the peasants harder. But by 1850, those tricks no longer worked. The empire needed capital on a scale that internal methods could not provide. And then in 1853, the crisis arrived. Russia invaded Ottoman territory in what is now Romania. It was the beginning of the Crimean War. The Ottoman army mobilized, but the treasury was empty. Soldiers needed to be paid. Cannons needed to be cast. Ships needed to be provisioned. The Sultan faced a choice. He could let the empire collapse, or he could break the ancient taboo. He chose survival. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire took its first foreign loan from a syndicate of British and French banks. The amount was 4 million British pounds. It was marketed as a gesture of Allied solidarity. Britain and France were joining the war against Russia, and they were helping their Ottoman partner finance the defense. But the terms of the loan told a different story. The bankers knew the Ottomans were desperate. They structured the deal to maximize their profit and minimize their risk. The bond was issued at 80% of face value. This meant that for every 100 pounds of debt the Sultan signed for, he only received 80 pounds in cash. The other 20 pounds went to the bankers as fees and commissions, but the empire still had to pay interest on the full 100 pounds. The effective interest rate was punishing. It was over 10% when European governments were borrowing at 4 or 5%. The Ottoman Empire was being charged the rate you give to a gambler, not an ally. But when the gold arrived in Istanbul, it felt like a miracle. Suddenly the army could be equipped, the war could be fought, the Russians were eventually pushed back. The crisis was averted. The Sultan and his advisors learned a dangerous lesson. They learned that with a signature. On a contract in London, they could summon mountains of gold. They had discovered leverage. And like all people who discover leverage for the first time, they became addicted. The war ended in 1856, but the borrowing continued. The next Sultan, Abdulaziz, looked at Paris and London with envy. He saw the grand boulevards, and the opera houses, and the modern infrastructure. He wanted Istanbul to look like that. He wanted the world to see that the Ottomans were not backwards or medieval. He wanted respect. So he began to borrow not to defend the empire but to decorate it. The most infamous project was the Dolmabahce Palace. The old Topkapi Palace where the sultans had lived for 4 centuries was deemed too old-fashioned. Abdulaziz wanted a palace that would rival Versailles. He wanted to prove Ottoman greatness. The Dolmabahce Palace is genuinely breathtaking. It contains 14 tons of gold leaf. It has the largest crystal chandelier in the world. The staircases are made of baccarat crystal. The carpets are silk. The ceilings are painted by Italian masters. It is one of the most beautiful buildings ever constructed, and it was built entirely with borrowed money. The cost was 5 million Ottoman gold liras. That was roughly 1/4 of the empire's entire annual tax revenue spent on a single building. To pay for it, the Sultan went back to the European banks again and again. 1858, another loan. 1860, another loan. 1862, another loan. Each time the bankers were happy to lend because they were making fortunes on the fees. And each time the terms got worse. The empire was digging itself deeper. By 1865, the financial situation had become a classic Ponzi scheme. The empire was not generating enough tax revenue to pay the interest on its existing debt, so it had to take out new loans just to make the interest payments on the old loans. It was borrowing to pay borrowing. The debt service began to consume the entire budget. In 1860, the empire spent about 15% of its revenue on debt payments. By 1870, that number had exploded to over 50%. Let that sink in. Half of every coin collected from a shepherd in Anatolia or a merchant in Damascus was immediately sent to a bondholder in Europe. That meant there was no money left for schools, no money for roads, no money for the army. The state was being hollowed out from the inside. To keep the system alive, the government turned to local moneylenders in Istanbul known as the Galata bankers. These were Greek and Armenian financiers who acted as loan sharks. When the treasury was empty and a big payment was due, the Grand Vizier would go to these men and borrow at short-term rates of 18 or 20%. It was financial insanity, but the Sultan kept spending. Abdulaziz decided the empire needed a modern navy. He looked at the British Royal Navy and wanted one too. He ordered massive ironclad warships from British shipyards. He bought the latest rifled cannons from Germany. For a few years, the Ottoman Navy was the 3rd largest in the world on paper. But the ships just sat in the harbor rusting because there was no coal to fuel them and no money to maintain them. They were floating monuments to debt. The tipping point came in 1873. A global financial panic started in Vienna and spread across Europe and America. It was called the Long Depression. Credit markets froze. European banks stopped lending. The music stopped. At exactly the same moment, a catastrophic drought struck Anatolia. The crops failed. Famine spread. The peasants, who were the tax base of the empire, had nothing left to give. Tax collectors went into villages and found only starvation. The revenue collapsed. But the debt payments were fixed. They did not care about droughts or famines. The bonds had to be paid. In the summer of 1875, the Grand Vizier looked at the books and realized the game was over. The treasury was completely empty. There was a massive bond payment due in October, and there was no money to pay it. He tried to float a new loan, but no bank would touch them. The empire faced a brutal choice: starve the population to pay foreign bankers or stop paying. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued the Decree of Muharrem. It announced that debt payments would be cut in half. 50% would be paid in cash. The other 50% would be paid in paper IOUs. In diplomatic language, this was called a moratorium. In financial language, it was a default. The Ottoman Empire had gone bankrupt. The reaction in Europe was explosive. Hundreds of thousands of middle-class investors in Britain and France had bought Ottoman bonds because they offered high yields. Vicars in England and shopkeepers in Paris saw their savings wiped out overnight. The newspapers called the Turks thieves and criminals. The political support that Britain and France had given the Ottomans evaporated. Russia saw the weakness and pounced. In 1877, the Russian army invaded. The Russo-Turkish War was a catastrophe for the Ottomans. The army fought bravely, but they were unpaid and undersupplied. The Russians marched to the suburbs of Istanbul. They could see the minarets from their camps. The empire was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, giving up vast territories in the Balkans. But the worst part was financial. Russia imposed a massive war indemnity. They demanded over 800 million francs as punishment. Now the Ottoman Empire owed hundreds of millions to European bondholders and hundreds of millions to Russia. The total debt was larger than the entire value of the economy. The empire was insolvent. The new Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, sat in his palace waiting for the European powers to carve up his lands. But the Europeans had a smarter idea. They realized they did not need to invade the Ottoman Empire. Invasion was expensive. It required armies and administration and risk. They had a better plan. They would conquer it financially. In 1881, representatives of the European bondholders came to Istanbul. They were not generals. They were accountants. They carried briefcases, not swords. They sat down with Ottoman officials and dictated the terms of surrender. The result was the Decree of Muharrem issued in December 1881. It created something that had never existed before. It was called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. In Turkish, it was the Düyün Ümumiye. In English, it was simply the OPDA. This was the mechanism of the soft conquest. The OPDA was not a government agency. It was a private corporation controlled by a board of directors representing the banks of Britain, France, Germany, Austria, and Italy. It was headquartered in a fortress-like building in Istanbul that still stands today, and it was given extraordinary power. The decree handed over the empire's most valuable revenue streams directly to this foreign corporation. The Sultan agreed that the taxes on salt, silk, tobacco, spirits, stamps, and fisheries would no longer be collected by Ottoman officials. They would be collected by the OPDA. The OPDA built its own bureaucracy. It hired over 5,000 employees. These men wore uniforms and carried guns. They answered to the board in Istanbul, not to the Sultan. They spread out across the empire from the Balkans to Syria. They went into villages and markets and ports. They collected taxes from fishermen and farmers and merchants. And they sent the money to Europe. The system was breathtakingly efficient. Unlike the corrupt Ottoman bureaucracy, the OPDA used modern European accounting. They built warehouses. They improved infrastructure in the sectors they controlled. They actually grew the economy in those areas. But they grew it for the benefit of European bondholders, not Ottoman citizens. Between 1881 and 1914, the OPDA collected roughly one-third of all Ottoman government revenue. 1 out of every 3 coins generated in the empire was taken by this foreign corporation and sent abroad. The Ottoman government was left with 2/3 of its own tax base to run a massive empire, pay an army, and maintain a state. They were perpetually broke. They could not invest in education or industry or infrastructure. The surplus that should have been used to develop the country was being extracted to service old debt. The Sultan became a figurehead. He reigned, but the OPDA ruled. If he wanted to build a school, he had to ask the bankers if there was money left over. Usually there was not. But the debt trap was not just about money. It was about control. The European powers used the OPDA to manipulate Ottoman policy. And this opened the door for Germany. While Britain and France were content to squeeze the Ottomans financially, Germany saw a strategic opportunity. Kaiser Wilhelm II visited Istanbul and embraced the Sultan. He said the British and French were parasites. He said Germany wanted to be a true friend. The Germans proposed a grand project, the Berlin to Baghdad Railway. It would connect Europe to the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. It would bypass the British-controlled Suez Canal. For the Sultan, this was a lifeline. A railway would allow him to move troops quickly. It would modernize the economy. But the treasury was empty, controlled by the OPDA. The Germans said, "Do not worry, we will lend you the money." A new cycle of debt began. Deutsche Bank financed the railway. But the contracts were predatory. They included kilometric guarantees, meaning the Ottomans had to pay the Germans a guaranteed profit for every kilometer of track, even if no one used the trains. And the contracts gave Germany the rights to all oil and minerals within 20 kilometers of the tracks. The Sultan had traded British financial chains for German steel ones. By 1910, the Ottoman Empire was effectively a German economic colony. German officers trained the army. German engineers ran the infrastructure. German banks held the new debt. Britain and France watched with fury. The debt of the sick man was no longer just about money. It was pushing Europe toward war. When World War I broke out in 1914, the Ottomans made a desperate gamble. They joined Germany. They believed that if Germany won, they could cancel the debts to Britain and France. They could abolish the OPDA. They could be free. On the day they declared war, Ottoman soldiers marched into the OPDA headquarters in Istanbul. They expelled the British and French directors. They stopped the payments. For a brief moment they tasted freedom, but the gamble failed. The war was a disaster. The empire was destroyed, but the debt survived. When the Turkish Republic was founded by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in 1923 after a brutal war of independence, the European powers returned with their ledgers. At the Treaty of Lausanne, they demanded that Turkey pay the debts of the dead empire. They said, "You inherited the land, you inherit the mortgage." Ataturk fought, but he knew Turkey needed access to global markets. He could not start as a defaulter. So he agreed to pay. The debt was restructured, but the obligation remained. The new Turkish Republic, poor and devastated, spent its first 30 years sending millions abroad to pay for the reckless spending of sultans from the 1850s. The final payment on the Ottoman debt was made on May 25, 1954. It took exactly 100 years to pay off the mistake. The story of the Ottoman debt trap is the ultimate cautionary tale. The Ottomans thought they could buy modernity with borrowed money. They did not realize that every loan is a leash, every bond is a chain. The British and French did not need to conquer Istanbul with armies. They simply waited for compound interest to do the work. The sick man of Europe did not die of old age. He was foreclosed upon. And the lesson is written in red ink. Sovereignty is not just about flags and anthems. Sovereignty is about solvency. If you do not control your debt controls you. That building in Istanbul still stands. Tourists walk past it taking pictures. But they do not know what it represents. It represents the moment when a new kind of empire was born. An empire that does not occupy territory. It occupies balance sheets. And that empire is still with us today.